Exaggerating one's own successes and spreading false propaganda were commonplace during the First World War. It was meant to maintain the willingness of the people to go to war, since they had to give up their fathers and sons and pay for everything as well. To prove superiority to the enemy and to motivate one's own soldiers to make even greater efforts so that the war would soon end in victory. But when, decades later, the exaggerations made during the war are practically made official, and historians and journalists adopt them without verification. For example, grossly exaggerated figures, they become almost impossible to dispel. This is also the case with a military event that is said to have taken place on the 7th of June, 1917, in the south of the West Flemish city of Ypres, exactly between the towns of Vichite and Messines, or Messines, named after the monastery founded there in the 11th century by Adela of France. There, at the beginning of the Battle of Messines, the simultaneous detonation of 19 massive mines under the German positions is said to have killed 10,000 German soldiers in one blow. Other sources have even invented fantasy figures of up to 25,000. However, if the journalists who have been spreading these figures, which have not been confirmed anywhere for 116 years, had basic military knowledge, common sense, and the will to invest some time in their own research, they would have quickly realized themselves that this story probably played out differently than they reported. The Battle of Messines, which began on the 7th of June, 1917, is considered one of the most successful British offensives of the First World War. At the time, it also boosted the morale of the Commonwealth divisions deployed there, which were always inferior to the Germans in terms of personnel and equipment. The battle was led by the British General Herbert Plumer, commander of the Second Army. After the Messines detonation and the subsequent successful attack by his 9 divisions, supported by over 72 tanks and consisting mainly of Irish, Australian, New Zealand, and Canadian troops, he wanted to continue the offensive, but was stopped by the Commander-in-Chief of British troops on the Western Front, Scottish cavalry officer and Field Marshal Douglas Haig. Haig, who had been nicknamed the Butcher by soldiers since the Battle of the Somme in 1916, which resulted in extremely high British casualties, and whose critics judged him to be stubborn, with no sense of self-criticism or innovation, had viewed the Battle of Messines merely as a preliminary and diversionary maneuver. For the Third Battle of Flanders, which lasted from July 31st to November 6th, during which the Entente finally wanted to achieve a breakthrough in the Ypres area. To this end, Haig had assembled divisions from across the Commonwealth alongside the British forces, Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians, Newfoundlanders, and South Africans. Then, when the Third Battle of Flanders ended in November, only the village of Passchendaele had been captured, apart from strategically rather unimportant sections. Here before and after, but with such heavy losses that even Winston Churchill later called the battle a disaster. From July 31 to November 19, 1917, 50,335 British soldiers were killed, 235,750 were wounded, and 38,105 were missing. So, total losses amounted to 324,190 men. However, German losses in the 4th German Army, which was stationed in this section, were just as dramatic for the period from the 1st of August to the 10th of November 17. 32,878 soldiers were killed, 165,280 were wounded, and 38,083 were missing, bringing the total losses to 236,240 men. I mention these figures to illustrate the scale of what these battles, or rather slaughter, had wrought among the soldiers on both sides, without either side having gained much. It was stated in a publication by the German General Staff that Germany had been brought closer to its certain downfall by the Battle of Flanders in 1917. At the same time, David Lloyd George, who was the British Prime Minister from 1916 to 1922, also wrote that Passchendaele, as the British call this battle, was actually one of the greatest disasters of the war. Today, no intelligent soldier defends this senseless campaign anymore. The reality, however, despite later British criticism of the measures taken by their generals, was that at the time these were exactly the directives of all British politicians. We must therefore be grateful to the British historian Jack Sheldon, who summed it up by saying that relative loss figures were irrelevant because the German army could not afford these losses and because they had also lost the initiative as a result, as it was forced to fight another defensive battle on a battlefield chosen by the Allies. The Third Battle of Ypres had tied down the German army in Flanders and caused unacceptable losses. And this is supposed to include the 10,000 victims caused by the detonation of 19 super-heavy mines, which are mentioned in the countless publications. Back then, all of this sounded like a great success for the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps deployed there. Australia, which for many years had been known as the Penal Colony of Australia and had mobilized 400,000 men against Germany in the First World War, had been filled since 1787 with English criminals and crooks brought there by ship, a total of around 162,000. Now, after being constantly bombarded with anti-German British propaganda during the First World War, their descendants had been recruited and shipped from Australia to France, 15,000 kilometers away, to fight and die for Britain's glory. Then, at the beginning of June 17, around 25,000 men were ready in the 2nd Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, with the New Zealand Infantry Division, the 3rd Australian, and the 25th British Infantry Division, to attack the German positions in West Flanders, shown in brown, in a semicircular arc about 15 kilometers long, called the Wytschaete Arc, which ran through the towns of Wytschaete and Messines and connected to the Ypres Arc in the north. Opposing the Commonwealth divisions was the 4th German Army under the command of the infantry general Sixt von Arnim, who was born in Wetzlar. The direct opponent of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps troops was the 14th Army Corps, 2nd Royal Saxon, which bore the name Group Wytschaete from January 7 to June 13, 1917. This large unit had been commanded until his sudden death on June 17 by the Royal Saxon Cavalry General Maximilian von Laffert. His successor was the Royal Saxon Infantry General Adolf von Karlowitz. In order to take out the well-constructed German trenches, bunkers, command posts, and artillery positions, General Plumer's forward artillery observers bombarded the hill position of the Wytschaete group deployed there, which was up to 84 meters high, with around 2,200 heavy guns around the clock from the 21st of May to the 7th of June. That is, for 16 days. The hill position of the Wytschaete group deployed there, which was up to 84 meters high, with around 2,100 heavy guns firing around the clock, virtually plowing it up, as here at Messines. The British infantry attack was scheduled for the morning of June 7 and was also expected by the German command. What the soldiers of the Wytschaete group did not suspect, however, was that they had already been fought by an invisible enemy for almost 2 years. By the mining companies of the British pioneer troops, who had been tunneling towards them underground every day. The use of underground mines had begun on the German side in the autumn of 1914, after the failed Battle of the Marne and the beginning of trench warfare, when the soldiers had tried every possible way to harm the enemy. Then, in October 1914, the 1st Company of Pioneer Battalion 16 in the 33rd Jaeger Division detonated the first German mine at an altitude of 285 in the Argonne under a French post, which was buried as a result. This explosion had triggered the German-French mine war. Then, on the morning of the 20th of December, during the battle at Givenchy in French Flanders, 10 German mines, each weighing 50 kilos, were detonated under the positions of 2 companies of the 4th Gurkha Infantry Regiment, which belonged to the 9th Indian Syrian Brigade that had been brought to France a month earlier, and which had then been attacked by the German infantry. Mine companies were now also formed among the British in Flanders. By March 15, 8 were already operational. By mid-16, this British unit included around 25,000 tunnelers, mostly miners, but also, for example, Australian gold prospectors. Another 50,000 soldiers, mostly infantrymen, were used to transport the enormous amounts of earth that accumulated. When, from the summer of 17, the trench warfare on the Western Front, which had come to a standstill since the autumn of 14, became more mobile again, this also had an effect on the now decreasing number of tactical explosions. When digging was done now, the miners mainly focused on deep tunnel systems for accommodating the troops. As a result, by the end of 17, more soldiers on the British side were living underground than on the surface. The use of underground detonated mines or explosives to fight the enemy is as old as the invention of gunpowder. But mine warfare reached its peak during the trench warfare of the First World War. The mine officer responsible for the combat zone of the 4th German Army was Lieutenant Colonel Otto Füsslein, born on the 9th of May, 1870 in Saalfeld, Thuringia, and died on the 29th of September, 1921, after falling into a shaft while conducting surveying work in the Schmiedefelder iron mines near Saalfeld. After finishing high school and a locksmith apprenticeship, Füsslein joined Pioneer Battalion No. 4 and was promoted to lieutenant in 1891. After attending the artillery and engineering school in Charlottenburg near Berlin, he was transferred in 1904 as a surveying engineer to the Great General Staff in Berlin, and then a year later to the Colonial Protection Force in Southwest Africa. Back in Germany, from 1906 onwards, he had further assignments with the troops, extensive study trips, and in 1911 he was promoted to major. During the First World War, after various command assignments in the Pioneer Corps, Füsslein became commander of the miners of the 4th Army in 1916, the front section of the Battle of Messines. However, compared to the resources of the British, he had far too few mine companies at his disposal, and there were too few professional miners in the existing ones. Also, at first, the sapper companies were moved along with their divisions and replaced by less qualified engineers who were not familiar with the area, which led to serious consequences. In addition, there were material shortages affecting almost all engineering areas, such as the lack of waterproof clothing, seals, hoses, lamps, generators, drilling equipment, mine rescue equipment, telephone systems, or good listening devices. There was also a recurring shortage of moisture-resistant explosives, or simply explosives in general. However, it was different for the Commonwealth's engineer troops. Here is their unit insignia, where they always had plenty of resources, and where the leadership prevented possible jealousy or know-it-all attitudes, as was often the case on the German side, by giving clear orders. Because unlike the German military leadership, which saw mine warfare as a necessary but ultimately useless evil, the British had conducted an offensive mine war with strategic objectives from the very beginning. That is why General Plumer on the left, together with Field Marshal Haig on the right and in the center of the picture, and Haig's Chief of Staff, General Herbert Lawrence, decided on the 30th of May 17, in a meeting for the attack on the 7th of June at Messines, that, in addition to the massive use of artillery, parallel mine explosions would also take place. In order to gain decisive offensive advantages from the very beginning through the expected large-scale devastation of the German trench and bunker system and the panic among the soldiers. As early as 1915, tunnel construction work had begun towards the 84-meter-high hill position of the Weizsäcker group deployed there. They were reinforced again in 1916 when British mining companies dug tunnels several kilometers long and up to 100 meters deep. However, there were also numerous fatalities, for example due to the collapse of shafts. But the German mining units, the Red Arrows, also did not remain idle. Alarmed by drilling and other noises, they had been trying since the spring of 1916 to cut off the British tunnels with attack and defense galleries. But all the excavations had been started too late to be able to achieve anything decisive. Shortly before the British attack on June 7, 1917, the Chief of Staff of the 2nd British Army, General Charles Harrington, remarked ironically, "I don't know if we'll make history tomorrow, but in any case, we'll change the geography." He would be proven right. Because when, at 3:10 in the morning, 19 mines were detonated almost simultaneously under the German positions, and, at the same time, the 2,100 heavy guns increased their fire once again, not only had parts of the German positions disappeared, but many soldiers were also gripped by panic. However, there are also reports from affected units that attached less importance to the effect of panic. In any case, British newspapers, as part of the propaganda war against Germany also waged by the press, used the explosions as an opportunity for their claim. The mine detonations were so loud that even Prime Minister David Lloyd George, who was sleeping at number 10 Downing Street, some 260 kilometers away, was awakened by the thunderous rumble of the mine explosion in Messines. However, it is more likely that the Prime Minister and other Britons actually heard the roar of the synchronized barrage from the heavy artillery, which followed the detonation for several minutes. Due to the explosion and the intense artillery bombardment, parts of the 204th Württemberg Infantry Division under Lieutenant General Hermann von Stein and parts of the 2nd East Prussian Infantry Division under Lieutenant General Rudolf Reiser suffered moderate to heavy losses. The 35th Prussian Infantry Division under Major General Johannes von Hahn and the Bavarian 4th Infantry Division under Lieutenant General Prince Franz von Bayern. Severe to extremely severe losses amounting to 800 men due to 8 mines detonated in their sector were suffered by the Royal Bavarian 3rd Infantry Division under Lieutenant General Hugo von Huller and 1,000 men by the Royal Saxon 40th Infantry Division under Lieutenant General Johann Meister. The fact that these two divisions were so heavily affected was partly due to the fact that both large units were in the process of being relieved that night, and the 40th Division had not passed on the information it had about the mine threat in a certain sector, which was also confirmed by the Commander-in-Chief of the Army Group, Crown Prince Ruprecht, Field Marshal Ruprecht von Bayern, on June 20, 1917. Despite the information sheets issued by the commander of the sappers, the danger was not recognized by either the troop staffs or the troops themselves. The 3rd Bavarian Infantry Division, which was particularly affected by the explosions, was not aware of any mine threat at all because the warning about it was negligently omitted when taking over the combat sector from the 40th Infantry Division. The other divisions, despite verifiable warnings from the commander of the sappers, completely misjudged the situation. And the Chief of Staff of Army Group, Crown Prince Ruprecht, Lieutenant General Hermann von Kuhl, confirmed after the war that on April 30th he had tried to convince the commanders in the 4th Army, when a mine threat was detected, to pull the regiments back from the line shown in blue, called Line 1A, and move them to the so-called special line shown in light green, which lay between the first position and the second position shown in red. However, he wasn't heard. After 19 of the 25 mines shown in red had been detonated, 6 in blue had failed, and the fire roll of the 2,100 guns had moved on. When the Commonwealth infantry regiments advanced into the completely shattered positions of the first German lines, the defense there had collapsed. Between 8 and 9 o'clock, the British had taken the yellow-marked locations of Wetzstede and Messines, reached the dark green line in the evening, and were only stopped on the 14th June at the Purple Lake position. During these heavy, extremely costly battles, the son of Lieutenant Colonel Füsslein, Hans Georg, an ensign in the 3rd Company of the Pioneer Regiment 25, was also killed. The largest of the 19 mines detonated on June 7th, filled with 42 tons of explosives, was set off a little more than 5 kilometers south of Ypres, near Saint-Éloi. It took 30 soldiers from the 1st Canadian Sappers and Engineers Company 3 weeks to transport this monster and make it operational. The other 18 mines detonated had an average weight of 21 tons, meaning that at 3:30 on the 7th of June, around 500 tons of explosives had been detonated under the German positions, allegedly killing 10,000 soldiers within seconds. However, that is an estimate put into the world by a British author not long ago, which has not been confirmed by any official source to this day. Even though, especially in the case of such a unique wartime event, the details would have long since been clarified by official sources. Because to assume a number of casualties of that magnitude, there would have had to be fresh, fully staffed companies in the trenches and shelters, not ones that were sometimes half decimated and so exhausted from months of fighting that they just wanted to sleep whenever they had a free moment. Furthermore, at the time of the detonations, all companies would have had to be in the trenches and shelters, which had always been avoided in order to keep casualties low in the event of an attack. Therefore, usually only one company was in the trench, while the others stayed in the rear combat zone, which was connected by covered communication trenches and where partially underground barracks for thousands of soldiers had been dug. If an alarm was raised or there was imminent danger, the positions in the first line were occupied. The New Zealand military historian Ian C. McGibbon also assesses it similarly, and concludes that the figure of 10,000 represents the total number of German fatalities during the entire 3-day battle. It is undisputed that the mass explosion caused a very high number of deaths and injuries. But in order to put the figure of 10,000, which is still published in unofficial publications today, into perspective, all the numbers must be compared with each other while taking the military situation into account. And it must also be borne in mind that the term casualties refers to those killed, wounded, scattered, and missing, whereby, for example, lightly wounded soldiers who returned to their regiment after a week were not always removed from the original number of wounded in the prevailing chaos during the battle, nor were they reported as available again. And under the term missing, all soldiers who were taken prisoner of war were also included. After all, on the German side, due to the chaos of the demolitions, the artillery bombardment, and the subsequent retreat that resembled a flight, there was no one who counted the dead or wounded among the rubble. Once again, as a reminder, the Battle of Messines, which had begun on the morning of the 7th of June with the detonation of 19 mines, had lasted a week until the 14th of June. In addition, Charles Bean, a journalist commissioned by the Australian government, calculated the following for the Wetzstede Bogen battlefield using figures from the German Reich archives. From the 21st to the 31st of May, 1,963 casualties. From the 1st to the 10th of June, 17. This period also includes 3 days after the explosion on the 7th. 19,923 men, including 7,548 missing. From the 11th to the 20th of June, the still high number of 5,501, and from the 21st to the 30th of June, 1,773. British Brigadier General James Edward Edmonds, editor of the official British history of the First World War, calculated 21,886 German casualties between the 21st of May and the 10th of June. That is, again 3 days after the explosions and the start of the battle, including 7,548 missing. And finally, German military historians from the Reich Archives mention in Volume 12 of the series on the World War, for the period from the 21st of May to the 10th of June, i.e. for 21 days, 25,000 men were lost, including 10,000 missing, of whom, however, 7,200 had been reported as captured by the British. In contrast, British losses of the Second Army from May 18th to June 10th, that is, over 28 days, amounted to 28,000 men, of whom 3,000 were missing. However, none of these official or semi-official investigations mention the alleged 10,000 German soldiers who are said to have been killed within a few seconds. Instead, both British and German publications only refer to high losses or, when loss figures are given, always refer to the entire period of the battle. This also applies to the German Army report shown here from June 7th. Which states, highlighted in green, that the explosions caused few casualties due to the thin occupation of the trenches, but did have a strong psychological effect on the soldiers. There is nothing to be read about 10,000 soldiers being killed in one blow. And the commander of the German sappers, Lieutenant Colonel Füsslein, is even said to have proven that at most, 35 men lost their lives during the detonation under the 3rd Bavarian Division, while the others fell in the heavy defensive battles that followed. However, such findings, especially when made after the war, must be treated with caution because it is possible that they were intended to absolve the sappers of the Fourth Army, and especially their commander, from sole responsibility. That is understandable, because many were responsible for the disaster, including the unclear chain of command and the carelessness of the units involved. The Bavarian Book on the World War, published in 1930 by Bavarian General A.D. Kraft von Dellmensingen and others, mentions the Bavarian troops who were particularly badly affected or decimated by the explosions. The 23rd Infantry Regiment King Ferdinand of the Bulgarians, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th companies were blown up. When gathering on June 8th, about 600 men were still alive. Thus, 2 days after the start of the battle, more than 29 officers and 1,000 men of this regiment had fallen, which, with around 5,000 fallen during the war, stands at the top of all Bavarian regiments. In the area of the 18th Infantry Regiment of Prince Ludwig Ferdinand, also from Landau, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd companies of the 3rd Battalion in the front line had been virtually wiped out in one fell swoop by the explosions, with 329 soldiers killed. In the Royal Bavarian 17th Infantry Regiment Orff, the entire 2nd Battalion was affected by the explosion. In the 9th Bavarian Infantry Regiment Raid, companies 10, 11, and 12 were almost completely buried. 7 officers and 25 men were killed. 10 officers and 353 men were missing. But if you add up these numbers, they are far below the imaginary figure of 10,000. Well, this figure was put forward by former British pioneer Major Ian Passingham, who died in March 2020 in his book, published in 1998, where he claims that of the 10,000 German soldiers who went missing after the battle, many were undoubtedly vaporized or blown to pieces by the effects of the mines. In doing so, Passingham had probably based the figure of 10,000, missing on the official German numbers from the Reich archives. However, these figures covered a period of 21 days, that is, up to the 10th of June, 1917. In addition, according to British figures, 7,200 had been taken prisoner, which reduced the number of missing to 2,800. So, Passingham's claim of 10,000 killed in one blow was pure invention and not supported by any official figure, not even close. In addition, reports from some regiments stated that many of their soldiers were not killed by the mine explosions, but rather beforehand by the massive and highly effective British artillery fire, which lasted for 16 days, and then resumed shortly after the mines were detonated. And then in the hopeless fight against the rest of superior force. Of all the German victims, there is only this one photograph. Finally, the question remains as to why the devastating 19 funnel explosions of the 7th of June, 1917 could not be prevented, despite all the countermeasures taken by the German miners. Exemplary documentation from the Bundeswehr Center for Geoinformation has provided information on this. Because in addition to the already mentioned constant shortage of personnel and materials, there were also serious organizational problems. Here are just a few examples among many. A negative attitude of the military leadership toward mine warfare, no overarching mining plan that crossed army boundaries, independence of the divisions in mine warfare, which were also not bound by the instructions of the commander of the engineers. Little support from the infantry, ignoring timely warnings, and, despite warnings, no withdrawal of troops from the threatened front line. Too few decoys and ultimately uncooperative behavior by the divisions towards the commander of the engineers. But this does not entirely exonerate Lieutenant Colonel Füsslein either. On the 8th of March 1917, 3 months before the British detonated their mines, he had circulated a leaflet on how to behave in the event of enemy explosions, but instead of preparing the troops realistically for the existing mine threat, it was intended to allay their fears of an emergency with platitudes. If the troops behave correctly, such explosions are not very dangerous for the infantry in the trench garrisons, as long as the front line is kept thinly manned. And further, enemy explosions in our lines may cause more casualties because they may destroy parts of the positions. But in most cases, the actual effect is less, and only the initial surprise makes it seem greater than it is. When, on the 7th of June, the British divisions attacked the German positions, which had already been shattered by the previous 16 days of artillery bombardment, following the mine detonations and the ensuing barrage lasting several minutes, it can be assumed that a large number of the shocked German defenders had either fled or surrendered. And those who, despite their shock from the mine detonations and the many fallen comrades, had defended themselves, quickly fell victim to the British superiority. So, the number of 10,000 casualties is possible, but not due to the detonation of 19 mines under the German positions, rather in combination with the following heavy artillery barrage from 2,100 guns, and the bloody defensive battles of the decimated German regiments during the following days, against an enemy superior in both manpower and equipment. The German casualties of the Battle of Ypres, the 3 Flanders battles, and the Battle of Messines, discussed here, about 48,000 soldiers, rest in the Belgian military cemetery at Messines. According to the victors at the time, the First World War was supposed to be the last of all wars. They were terribly mistaken in this and other respects. Since the end of the Second World War alone, at least 60 to 65 million people have died in wars worldwide. How did the great seismograph of the times, Friedrich Nietzsche, judge this? Man is evil, so said all the wisest men to comfort me.